right. Welcome, everyone, to another installment of The Way It Is. I am your host, Luke Andelfato with RE/MAX Service First Realty, Inc. And today's episode, we are very fortunate and thrilled to have with us Dr. Gerald Evans. And I am just before we get him to say hello, I'm just going to read his brief biography. He is the current chair of the Division of Infectious Diseases and a professor in the departments of medicine, biomedical, and molecular sciences and pathology and molecular medicine at Queen's University, an attending physician in infectious diseases at Kingston Health Sciences Center. He has been the medical director of infection prevention and control at Kingston Health Sciences Center and Providence Care Hospital since 2011. He is a member of the Ontario COVID-19 Science Advisory Table, the Ontario COVID-19 Testing Strategy and Policy Task Force, and the Ontario COVID-19 Behavioral Sciences Working Group, and currently the editor-in-chief of the official journal of the AMMI Canada Association of Medical Microbiology and Infectious Disease. Welcome, Dr. Evans.
Thank you very much, Luke. I appreciate that introduction, which I carefully crafted.
Well, it's impressive to say the least. And as we had the opportunity to just briefly chat before we went live here, and I mentioned I'm a fan of yours actually throughout the pandemic because I'm a CBC junkie, and so I've caught your snippets both on television and on Ontario Morning, and I dare say that you're one of the three voices that I listened to during the pandemic and trusted the insights and the commentary. So, with that being said, This podcast is quite timely. The only thing I didn't realize, and probably just because I didn't pay enough attention to it, was that you're on the Science Advisory Table, which of course is just in the news recently with the resignation of Dr. Fissman. And so obviously the concern there was some modeling that's happening and what modeling is being disclosed or not disclosed. Not to put you on the spot, but comment what you can and share your thoughts.
Well, firstly, I'd say, I think everyone needs to understand that the Science Advisory Table here in Ontario for COVID-19 is an entirely volunteer-driven exercise. All of us who sit on a table really do it out of the sort of kindness of our hearts to add on to all the other work that we do. Certainly, I've been doing a lot of work regionally here with all of our hospitals and working, of course, with TFLA Public Health. So the Science Table really is a large group actually now of fairly independent thinking individuals from various backgrounds. We deliberate on information that's brought to us, look at the science, look at the published literature and data. And some of the things we look at are models which are really constructed to project what might be happening. And it's always really important to understand when you're looking at models in general, which is part and parcel of this recent news item, is that, there are many different models, and some models pan out to be right. Some models pan out to be wrong. Some can be way off. So one of the things that's really important when we've been looking at modeling at the Science Table is to look at a group of models done by different groups, and that's done in a what's called the model consortium table. So they look at a number of different models, and then they present what they believe to be a relative consensus on what the most likely projections are for moving forward with COVID-19. And so I think it's really important that people understand that one person or some groups who in particular have a model that they believe in clearly may diverge from other models that exist, are likely to kind of go out there and suggest that somehow that's being withheld. But I can say that as a member of the Science Advisory Table, we've had no political interference whatsoever. We're a very independent group. Province gives us nothing, and the province doesn't always follow our advice, but sometimes they do follow the advice or the recommendations that we bring forward. And it's important to understand we offer these recommendations and advice really for anyone to look at and to decide if they're going to adopt it in the case of, for instance, the government or so, but they're under no obligation to do so. We're not a group pushed forward by the government or whatever else. So it's a challenging time. And certainly Lots of people, I think, have expressed some frustration at times with how things are moving. One of the interesting things that I'll say just to sort of finish the segment off is in looking at everything that's out there. You can take any issue with COVID-19, whether it's schools, whether it's transmission routes, whether it's modeling and projections, and you can find a huge spectrum across the public in people who have extremes of view quite opposite each other, a lot of people in the middle. And one of the things about pandemics, which because they're very stressful and anxiety provoking, is they tend to make people really kind of line up with one particular view or idea, and they stick with that and continue to stick with it throughout the pandemic. And things change, and we've learned lots as the pandemic's gone on. So in a way, some of the things that have been happening recently are just a function of what we know happens during stressful times like a pandemic.
So, and thank you, and I appreciate that clarification. But just to go back to one thing that you said, who initiated this table then? How did it come to be? What was its...
Well, I think the genesis of it was a group that had been doing some pandemic planning here in the province of Ontario. So the two chairs of the science table are Dr. Brian Schwartz, who I've known for many years. He's worked at Public Health Ontario for many years as an emergency planning coordinator, particularly around pandemic planning. And I myself was involved in pandemic planning back in 2003, both at a federal level, provincial level. And the other one was Steiny Brown, who's the dean at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health. And they, I think, really went out with the ideas, let's bring together a whole group of experts. And they went to many of the academic centers, including Queen's here in Kingston, and asked for representation that could be provided to the table. For some reason, they chose me. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm an infectious disease doctor and I did pandemic planning, but yeah, so, and that really occurred across the whole province. And so that table was brought together. It was funded, I think, primarily through the Dalai Lama School, and that funding just really went to administrative support. It did not go to any of the members of the panel. And then we've been meeting very regularly, really about 2 times per week, for going back now, at least 12 to 14 months. And some of the commentary recently about us being quiet is that some of us needed a bit of a break. I just came off a 2-week holiday because we've been working fairly strong, and we put this, we add this on to all the work that we normally do, and many of us hold down at least a full-time job, if not what some people would perceive as something that should be 2 full-time jobs. So essentially, that's really how the genesis came together, and so we look at the science, we look at material, we make recommendations, we analyze data, we look at modeling, and we offer that freely out there. With the primary people that tend to look at it are those that are in public health and the government, of course, in power.
Right. Well, okay, good. Well, I'm glad you explained that, because I think there probably is a bit of a jump, if you will, in the public's perception of the science table and its direct link to the public health officers, right, and the provincial government in terms of being in lockstep with them in terms of, hey, we say this, maybe you should react or should do this, right, and that's where sometimes you get these disconnects and you get these news stories. So I appreciate
Absolutely.
that.
Yep.
So we're in this 4th wave, I guess, officially. I mean, we're in Kingston, as you can attest to, and myself included, we've been relatively unscathed throughout the pandemic. Not that we didn't have our own issues in the heat of it, but now in this 3rd stage, I just had check the cases today, and I think we're at 14 active cases. But with the onset of Queen's University opening, elementary schools across the province opening, where are we with this variant and the Delta variant and what's happening right now?
Well, I'd certainly reiterate what you said. We've done very, very well here in the Southeast Ontario, not just in KFLA, but in the 2 neighboring public health units to the east and west of us throughout the pandemic. And we've certainly seen, we saw more cases in the 3rd wave, as did everyone across the province. So yes, we've been very fortunate. Some of that has to do with, I think, excellent leadership in public health, with following some good science and doing the right things. And at the same time, benefiting from a sort of lower population density, I always like to call it natural physical distancing in KFLA, because if you're outside the city, your next neighbor may be, a mile down the road or something like that. So it's not like you're crowded together in a densely populated urban city like Toronto or even Ottawa. But everything is a little bit different now because of the Delta variant. So the Delta variant has really changed a little bit of the complexion of the pandemic, in recognizing that we now have a variant of the original virus, which is much more transmissible than the original variant, and even more transmissible than the Alpha variant, which is what we dealt with through the winter and spring of 2021. And that has a lot of concern out there, because we know that if we're not careful and we try and reduce public health measures too much, the Delta variant is going to take advantage of that. There's no question about it. On the other side, we've got really good news in the fact that our current vaccination does an amazing job with all of the variants, including Delta, in providing significant protection from serious disease, from getting very sick that you would need to be hospitalized, and of course, ultimately also reducing the chances that you'll be in the ICU. It doesn't reduce it to zero, but really there are literally no vaccines that reduce the risk to zero, but they reduce the risk of that severe disease. They also reduce the risk of actually even getting infected. It's not quite at the levels we see of protection from serious disease, which is in the 90% range, but protection from actually even getting infected is probably somewhere around 60 or 70% with Delta. And then we know that there is a reduction in transmissions. So this is really helping us deal with a more transmissible variant like Delta by actually helping to reduce that sort of reproductive number. But no question about it, Delta is a real challenge. And as you sort of pointed out, as we bring people together again, particularly two populations, an unvaccinated population, which are kids under the age of 12 at the moment, because the vaccines are not yet approved for them. And then the other one is bringing together young people, many of whom, of course, are vaccinated and should be vaccinated. And really, I think there's a strong push that we really mandate vaccinations for those students in post-secondary institutions, colleges, and universities. But that's a group that we also have to deal with the fact that that is the time of your life, sort of between around 18 to about 30, 35, where you have your maximum socialization. So that's when you really get together with other people. And so it's really a matter of not only getting them vaccinated, but also encouraging young people, young adults, late adolescents to be, wary and careful about how they socialize. Because as you know, here in Kingston back in the spring, we had an outbreak that was associated with a large party that was attended to by a number of students from post-secondary institutions, Queen's and St. Lawrence College. And that resulted in some increased transmission. So that's one of the drivers. So if you balance things out, the Delta variant, bad, the vaccine, great. Socialization, a challenge in young adults in terms of trying to maintain public health measures. And then, of course, unvaccinated kids in school. But with everybody else vaccinated, particularly adults that are in school, the staff, the teachers, and others, we should be able to do things reasonably well. And I'm not a pediatrician. I do have kids of my own, but they're grown up now. The fact of the matter is that not being in school has been really detrimental to the health of young people, school-age children. And so we have to do everything we can to get schools back there. But at the same time, recognize that the Delta variant could very much challenge what we're trying to do with school openings. So yeah, you're right. That's the Delta variant to change the complexion of some of those things. And if you look at some places in the world, the Delta variant has really had a significant impact. Americans have closed schools, but America is very, the US is different from Canada. Their vaccination rates are not as high as ours. If you look at other jurisdictions, even in the world, including the UK, which has a really good vaccination rate, it's still not as good as Canada. So we're going to be able to look and determine how much of the impact of our very, very successful vaccination planning has gone here in Canada, because we're really one of the world leaders in vaccinating people against COVID-19.
And just to confirm, because I don't have it right in front of me, but Queen's has mandated double vaccinations, correct, for staff and student body then for the start of the semester?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they've mandated that everyone has to be fully vaccinated. So that means 2 doses of an approved vaccine. And Queens has really put into place that this is now the requirement if you're going to be attending the university on campus. And if you are not fully vaccinated for whatever reason, then accommodations being made to have your learning virtual will happen, and that means delivering it virtual. If you're someone like me who's a professor at the university, I'll deliver a lecture over Zoom or whatever. And if you're a student, then you're going to be attending some of those classes virtually, so that you're not on campus if you're unvaccinated. And this is really, happening across almost all the universities here in Canada.
Right, but here's the logistics or the how do you police these students that are leasing houses together where you have 3 out of a group of 5 that are fully vaccinated and 2 that maybe have 1 dose and 1 that doesn't have any. I mean, how therein is there's already a recipe for some issues, right? I mean,
yeah. No, you're absolutely right, and that's really the hard part. And the university is going to mandate that you produce proof of vaccination. That's going to be really important. There is a deadline date, which is recognizing that some people may not have been able to access vaccine because of where they have been prior to coming to school. There's an expectation, though, that you should be vaccinated by October. So, it is not easy. None of this is easy because. Unfortunately, we have had problems already. News stories about people who are producing false documentation about their vaccination status, et cetera. So, it becomes particularly challenging. And this is the hard work that needs to be done as we bring in things like vaccine mandates in a university or college to protect everybody. Because I can't underline how important vaccination is, not just to your personal health. We've just talked about serious illness and prevention of infection. Vaccinations protect people around you. It's something that you do altruistically to help others that are around you, whether they be family, friends, or just fellow students or colleagues. That's why vaccination is so important, because that will help us deal with it and deal with one of the biggest criticisms that's existed throughout the pandemic, which is businesses being closed and schools being closed and, universities working with virtual curricula and stuff like that. Like, that's how we solve this, is to get people vaccinated, maintain public health measures to watch how Delta emerges. And then we won't have to do all that lockdown stuff that everybody dislikes.
So, Dr. Evans, then how do we stop the disconnect for those that still have vaccination hesitancy, those that feel the vaccine? I mean, aside from those that are immunocompromised or have medical conditions that the vaccine may pose a threat or an undue, whatever to their systems, how do we solve that? Because we're still not at, I don't know what the actual stat is. We're at close to 80% now province-wide for at least 1 dose, if I'm not mistaken, and 60-something for double vaccines.
Yeah, the latest numbers would put us at about 65, 66% with full vaccination across Ontario, at 80 to 82% with 1 shot. And we do know that people who've already had 1 shot, so, we're looking at a difference there of about, 14, 15%. They will get a second shot. What we know about first shot people is over 95% of them will get a second shot. So we're moving towards what's going to be 82%, 80% plus of vaccination. We'd like it to be above 90 with Delta, maybe close to 92 or 93 in order to really get a really substantially good effect. So where does the problem lie? The problem has lied really with, if you think about it, about 80% of the population will completely accept vaccination. They're not hesitant at all. It's just a matter then of the practical nature of how do you get to a vaccine center and get it done if you're, not able to travel, et cetera. And we're trying to solve those. So the 20% that remains, half of those people are just what we call vaccine hesitant. So they're a little worried about maybe they're going to have a side effect. It can even be something like they don't like needles. It can be all kinds of things. But those people we can reach, we can educate, we can teach them, and we can get them vaccinated. So that leaves really essentially about 10% of the population where there's probably not a lot we can do with them at all. And that number is always varied between 8 and 10%. These are what are commonly called anti-vaxxers. I mean, they won't take it because they believe somehow in a conspiracy that vaccines cause terrible things to happen to people, or it's a way of inserting a microchip into you, or all kinds of odd and strange conspiracy theories. So that group is really, really hard, but we have the capacity to get to 90%. The one thing I would underscore, Luca, is that, exemptions, medical exemptions to getting the vaccine actually are almost non-existent for the mRNA vaccines. People who are immunocompromised, people who suffer from autoimmune disorders, even conditions which are not really illnesses, things like pregnancy and breastfeeding, actually there are no contraindications to receiving the vaccine. The only real contraindication of receiving the vaccine is if during the time you received the first vaccine, you had an adverse reaction. Well, we've got great data now, a study done in the United States that looked at a large number of those individuals, about 160 of them, who reported a serious reaction with the first dose. When they were given their second doses, very closely supervised by some of my colleagues in allergy and immunology, actually 80% of them were able to get their second dose without any problem. And 20%, the remaining 20%, their reactions to the second dose could be easily managed with some medication. So my colleague here in Kingston, Dr. Ann Ellis, who's the head of allergy and immunology here, she's been running a clinic, been very successful at getting people in who are worried about an allergy to polyethylene glycol, which is a component of both the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, people who have had what they thought were reactions to the first dose. And she's successfully immunized them with a second dose with almost no problems. So the exceptions with the autoimmune and immunocompromised conditions are not that the vaccine would cause them harm. It's that they might not benefit as much from the vaccine because their immune systems are suppressed a bit, and particularly the cells in your immune system which produce antibodies, which are called B cells. And so people who are transplant recipients of organs like kidneys and livers and hearts and lungs, as well as stem cells, and then people who have cancers that are related to the blood, in which the therapy they receive suppresses the B cells. Those people, if you immunize them, they don't get a really good response. And those are the groups that we want to give 3 doses to versus 2 doses. Okay, but there actually is no data that supports that these people have more adverse reactions. So I'll go back to my statement, which is that really there exists virtually no medical exemptions to getting the messenger RNA vaccines at all. And that is now being borne out with now having been, having been administered to, somewhere close to over 1.2 billion people around the planet. So vaccines are safe. They don't cause a lot of harms. Got a glass of water.
Absolutely. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Well, I'm ecstatic to hear that. And I believe in the science. And I've always believed that you got to follow the science. So I'm happy to hear you say that, because I didn't know that. So I appreciate that insight. I had a comment here, vaccine mandates. Obviously, you support them. And I think the provincial government is still on the fence with regards to teachers, though, going back to the schools and everything like that, because that isn't an official mandate yet, or at least provincial mandate yet. So we'll see where that falls, if at all. There's conversations out there in the US especially. It's been talked about here in Canada, this booster shot in the fall. Mm-hmm. And I guess I want to go back to, I was fortunate enough way back in my early days of podcasting. I had my own GP, Dr. Greg Barron, on, and we talked about, that was in the initial stages of a vaccine, hadn't even been created yet. But now we're saying that, what's the efficacy timeline of being double vaccinated? I mean, because I'd heard reports that maybe after the next 6 months, is this going to last for 6 months? It's going to last for a year before we need a booster? What are we looking at for timelines? Or can you even say?
Really great question. And this has been a little bit of a problem with the misinterpretation of some data that came out of Israel. And Israel is now mandated third shot. So the problem is that the interpretation of the data from Israel suggested that somehow there was a loss of efficacy over time, suggesting that people who had gotten the vaccine first, way back in December of 2020, somehow were now having higher rates of infection. So without boring your listeners to tears, the problem when you mix groups in a statistical analysis is you can get something called Simpson's paradox, in which mixing everything together actually creates an incorrect signal. And that's what's really happened with that Israeli data. Best to divide it into, if you're a healthy, normal person under the age of probably about 75, and you've received 2 doses of the vaccine, there is no data right now to suggest that protection has dropped off at all. And certainly even when you measure what we call a surrogate marker, which is antibody levels in your blood. Those are well preserved out to 9 or 10 months. And how long that protection is going to last, if we take information we know about coronaviruses in general, I was a coronavirus researcher as a young man, is we know that that kind of protective immunity actually lasts, if not years, sometimes decades. The problem is sterilizing immunity, that is prevention of infection, may drop off. And that's a little bit what we're talking about. So when you look at the booster question relates to what groups are likely to have waning immunity over time. And the groups that come out quickly on top are people who are recipients of transplanted organs or transplant medications, people who have certain hematological malignancies in which the ongoing treatment of it is suppressing that immune response to some degree. And they almost certainly, we've got data on those two groups that a third dose does a really amazing job of boosting levels. And then lastly, it's the very, very elderly. I was making a joke the other day as I'm getting older. Elderly, really, the age that elderly starts is pushing off into the future. So right now, I would say it's probably people over about 75 to 80 years old. Those people probably are going to benefit from a third dose, just because we know that in general, if you look at any vaccine, it's much more effective in young people. And so a 16-year-old has a much better immunogenic response to a vaccine than a 60-year-old who has a much better immunogenic response than somebody who's 90 years old. And so the very, very elderly may need a little bit of a boost. But what's confusing the signal even in the elderly is that if you get COVID when you're 85 years old, even if you're fully vaccinated, the problem is it is likely, highly likely, that you have other medical problems at that age. We all know as we age, we develop other issues that are related, whether to our genetics, our lifestyle, or whatever. And so when you start to see hospitalizations in 85-year-olds who have COVID-19, was it the COVID-19 that did it, or was the COVID-19 a bit of a trigger for something else that's popped up, which has then generated a need for hospitalization? And the point that I guess I would make is that as a physician, it's been well known for all my years as a doctor. If you fall and break your hip at the age of 85, so you fell down on the ice and you broke your hip, you went into hospital, actually that event by itself is a predictor that you're likely to, have a more severe outcome, including death, as a result of that. So, COVID-19 fits into that same thing. If you get COVID-19 and you're 85 and you go in hospital, maybe some of those things are just likely related to the underlying problems that you have that are now exacerbated by this event, whether it's a fractured hip or COVID-19. So deaths amongst people who are fully vaccinated, who are very elderly, have to be looked at very, very carefully in terms of the fact that there are what we call confounders. They're confounding what your ultimate conclusion is, which is that they died of COVID-19, when in fact they died because they got a hospital-related complication or something. So it gets very tricky, as I said, when you sort of look at this, and you have to be very, very careful of confounders in the sort of interpretation of whether boosters are needed. At this point, boosters are not required. If you're under age 75, you're pretty darn healthy, you've had 2 shots, you really don't need a booster at the moment. The people who need a booster are the very elderly, people who have transplants, and people with certain hematological cancers, because we have some science that tells us that they're likely to benefit. And even that science is a little bit predicated on, like I said, a surrogate marker, which is what their neutralizing antibody levels are. They may have fantastic protection, even with low levels of antibodies, because the immune system reacts very quickly when it's re-exposed to a threat like COVID-19.
Right. So I've been double vaccinated for a bit now, and so you only focus on the things that are top of mind when they need to be. But the 2 main vaccines that are still getting pushed through are Pfizer and Moderna. Then, correct, in Canada?
Correct.
Are there any others that have made the mainstream, or no? It's just
well, AstraZeneca is approved in Canada, but really the supplies of AstraZeneca have sort of dropped off here in Canada, and they are being directed to parts of the rest of the world to get vaccination rates up globally. And one of the good things about the AstraZeneca vaccine, along with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, both of which are adenovirus vector vaccines, is that they're very, very stable at, just refrigeration type temperatures. So if I'm working in equatorial parts of the world, those are great vaccines. As long as I have a fridge, I'm going to do fine. Pfizer and Moderna have a bit of an issue in that they really require ultra low cold storage, about -80 for Pfizer, about minus 20 for Moderna. And so you have to have special refrigeration units. Once you thaw them, they're actually pretty good. They're good for about 5 to 7 days after you thaw them out. But again, then you'd have to rush to get them into people. So the mRNA vaccines really are predominant here. And I guess part of it is that when we look at the signals for the efficacy, how good they are at preventing infection or serious infection and serious disease, I should say, is the mRNA vaccines clearly are the winners there. But one of the interesting things we did here in Canada is we allowed for mixing of vaccines. So you may have got AstraZeneca first, but then you could get a Pfizer. And the data that's coming out about people who got the mixed vaccine perhaps is actually really interesting. The immunity they get is incredibly robust. And that's because we think we have some evidence to suggest that the adenovirus vector vaccines like AstraZeneca stimulate the T cell arm of your immunity, which is one very important orchestrating arm, whereas the mRNA vaccines seem to stimulate the B cell side of your immune system. Again, important because that's what produces antibodies. They both stimulate both arms, but one a little bit more preferentially to the B cell or T cell arm. And so people who got vaccination with AstraZeneca first, Pfizer second, or in the UK, they even had Pfizer first, AstraZeneca second. Those people have really amazingly robust immune responses. And it's quite possible that, in the future, as we continue to develop vaccines, that might be a strategy, is to actually mix different platforms of vaccines to really take advantage of how the immune system handles those particular antigens when they're presented out to the immune system. So really exciting stuff. And Canada really has contributed a lot to that stuff, because we did things like extended interval, pans out 8 to 12 weeks between doses. It's almost ideal. Right. 3 to 4 weeks, which was being used early on because that's the way the trials were developed, that might not be quite as durable as this longer interval. So Canada did well there. We did well with mixing and matching. So yeah, lots of good stuff that's come out with the vaccines in terms of understanding that protection.
Well, a good positive unintended consequence then, obviously, from the mixing.
Well, I think in a weird way it was intended consequences. The problem is that for a lot of us, like myself as an infectious disease doctor, of course, I know a lot about vaccines. I studied them all my life. And vaccine science has told us lots about what we could expect with these vaccines. And in fact, that's been borne out. And so our Canadian committee, NACI, the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, was bang on when they said, well, let's look at the basic science of vaccines and say that this is what we should do. And guess what? It's panned out to be correct.
Wow, that's great. So given what you just described, and that, that our protections remain, robust, or at least without compromise going forward, what's going to happen in the next 12 to 24 months with this virus? I mean, are there more variants on the horizon? Will it burn out? Or are there just still going to be enough hosts out there for it to continue to evolve and keep hold?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you take a global perspective, it can be a little bit dire to look at. So, we've doled out somewhere around 1.2 to 1.3 billion doses of vaccine in the world, but there's 7 billion people. So we really haven't even gotten to, a quarter of them or so. With ongoing viral replication, there's always an opportunity for this virus to mutate to produce a different variant. Viruses don't mutate through a conscious mechanism. They mutate because there are viral replication cycles. And every time the virus replicates, it has the possibility of making a mistake. And the mistake may produce a genetic change which is favorable or unfavorable. Most of the time, by the way, it's unfavorable, but sometimes it's favorable. Alpha and Delta are nice examples, unfortunately, of that. So the only way to prevent the emergence of another variant is to really get on top of infections around the world, particularly in areas where, there are hundreds of thousands of cases a day. And I won't mention the country just to the south of us here in Canada, but that's an example of it. So really that's an important thing, because the generation of an even more transmissible variant, of course, would not be a good thing. And that's why global vaccination is so important. So that's the one thing. It's not going to burn itself out. This is a virus that has pretty well destined itself to become endemic within the population. And I'll just remind people who are listening, there's lots of human coronaviruses that are out there. They go by some really great, easy to remember names like 229E and OC43 and HKU1. But these are coronaviruses which produce a common cold syndrome. And all of us have had these. Typically, we had them when we were kids, but we get them intermittently during our life. And these are coronaviruses that emerged almost certainly from an animal reservoir and ultimately caused infections in humans, which later became, we became adapted to them either through the onset of good immunity or the virus itself didn't produce anything. So I suspect that's the fate for SARS-CoV-2, is it's going to become endemic. So that the only thing I can say is that vaccines are allowing us to see the evolution of that change from an epidemic or pandemic virus to an endemic virus a lot quicker than if we just let the virus rip around the world and produce all kinds of problems. So really in this next year, I think we're going to be looking at really continuing massive amounts of vaccination. There are new vaccines on the horizon, which are probably even going to be, dare I say it, more pleasing to people because they're based on platforms people are used to, like the recombinant subunit vaccines, which are a little bit like a Hep B vaccine, and almost all of us have had Hep B vaccines. That's what's sort of coming into the future. But right now, I think we're going to be looking at really whether or not this fourth wave, the question is really in my mind, is it going to be the difference between low tide and high tide, or is it going to be the difference between high tide and a tsunami, or maybe just a rogue wave? I guess there's three things: high tide, a rogue wave, and a tsunami. What we've been seeing with previous waves is something that resembles a bit of a tsunami, and certainly the Americans are facing that now, but the Americans have a much lower vaccination rate than us. So maybe what we're going to see here in Canada is a bit of a rogue wave that's a little less than maybe what we saw in wave 3. Maybe it'll just be high tide, and we're going to see an increase in cases, lots of worry and concern amongst people, but something that's we can stay on top of and control with public health measures and just continuing to massively vaccinate people. But this next 12 months, I guess, is going to be that sort of period as we move transition from really the unopposed first 3 waves that we saw here in Canada without vaccine to what the world's going to look like with vaccination, and particularly here in Canada with vaccination being able to control things. I'm not worried about an immune escape variant. I think that's very unlikely to occur. So that would be a variant where the vaccine doesn't work anymore. The immune system has an enormous amount of plasticity in it, its ability to recognize even slight alterations of a spike protein. So the vaccine you got gave you antibodies that protect you against alpha, against delta, and even some of the other variants where people were worried about this. So that doesn't really worry me. But really, the problem with the pandemic in general is really what it's done to society in general around the world, and really created and amplified a lot of divisiveness, which I think all of us have seen. Certainly, I think you've probably had podcasts talking about some of this. This is the bad part of a pandemic, because humans are I want to say not super well adapted all the time to dealing with prolonged stress. The difference between, as they said, a sprint and a marathon. Lots of people can sprint for 100 meters, but not many people can, run for 42 kilometers like you do in a marathon, and that's really causing a lot of really tough issues. People want to get out of this. I do too. My gosh, I'd love to go back to doing all the other stuff I did, take care of people with infections that weren't all necessarily COVID. But we have to work our way through it, and we have to do everything we can to support each other. I always liked last year when the prevalent philosophy is we're all in this together. And what's happened a bit now, I think, in 2021 is a bit more of the every dog out for himself kind of idea. So I'd like to see us get back to that we're all in this together kind of philosophy.
Well, and it's human nature, I guess, and human behavior, but it's amazing, since the stage 3 loosening of restrictions, how people just get complacent instantaneously. Like, it's just all of a sudden, it's like things are back to normal. And that speaks to, I guess, which region you're operating in or you're living in, because here, again, going back to Kingston, we have been relatively unscathed, and we're fortunate enough that we benefit from not only geography, but, having been ahead of the curve, so to speak, during the the entire first, second, and third waves. And you touched on it, and I'll reinforce it that, I dare say public health measures are a thing here to stay. I think that's going to be commonplace in the world to come. Our children, our children's children will grow up knowing that you need to wear a mask to enter a public space, or I hazard a guess that might be the norm going forward, and yet it's been determined that those are the greatest protectorants of everybody here.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess that was probably one of the things that I will do a mea culpa on. When COVID first started early in 2020, we saw lots of video and photographs of people wearing masks in Asia, where it's a bit of a cultural norm actually to wear a mask out in public especially during respiratory virus season. And I said, oh, well, I don't know how much masks are going to make a difference. Well, it panned out they made a huge difference. And eventually I could see the science was really telling us that. I think what we're going to see is a bit of a cultural shift. I think there will actually be something that more resembles what we've seen in Asia for many years, whether it's Korea, Japan, China, and some of the other countries where during respiratory virus season, people will wear masks because we know it really dramatically reduced influenza rates last year. I think we're going to see that kind of thing adopted a lot more broadly, and perhaps especially in schools. We're also going to see a culture where, having a respiratory infection and a cold, still going to work, which is really what has been the norm I've seen during most of my life. I think that's going to change too. I think we're now going to say, you know what, to control all these viruses, all of the respiratory viruses, influenza, SARS-CoV-2, rhinoviruses that cause the common cold. If you're sick, you probably should stay home for a day or two to, make sure you're in a recovery phase and no longer shedding virus before you go to your workplace, before you go back to school. So I agree with you. I think there are going to be those sorts of things coming into place, and they're all going to be to the benefit of everyone, because reducing respiratory viruses in general, remembering that before COVID-19 came along, people really worried about influenza. Yeah, we got to worry about things like influenza. We don't know what's going to happen with influenza this year with changes. And I would say that I think as the summer ends, because, this has been a summer of a lot of people, traveling a little bit outside of where they lived to go visit family and friends in some jurisdictions. By September, when schools are back and universities are back, that will reduce itself. So that'll be a bit of a public health measure already that will help to reduce things and keep people distant. And, ultimately, if this, high tide maybe turns into a rogue wave and threatens to be a tsunami, well, we'll have to go back to stage 2 or stage 1. Stage 2, I think, is likely. My only argument against stage 2, I'll throw out a little humorous note, is that we've got lots of evidence that getting your hair cut is not a risky event. So if we go to stage 2, I would, based on my readings of a lot of stuff related to the different kinds of activities, I would leave hairdressers open. I think that'll make a lot of people happy as well.
I think there's a giant cheer in the background. One of my dearest friends is the Brett Stickle, who owns and operates the James Brett Hair Salon. So I'm sure he's definitely going to clap and applaud when he hears that one, for sure. Well, and I'm booked to fly to Halifax, first time in 2 years, to see my children, because they live there and I haven't seen them in 2 years. And I'm not going to lie to you, I'm a little anxious about it. I haven't traveled, and nor have I had the desire to travel, but I think now's the window of opportunity to try to do it. But yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, go for it. Mask, you're fully vaccinated, wear your mask on the plane, which is mandated anyways. You're going to a province that really has very, very good control over the virus. They've done an amazing job in Nova Scotia. Hats off to Robert Strang, who's the public health officer, who I know well from our work that we've done together on Lyme disease things. Lisa Barrett, who's a colleague of mine, a virologist at Dalhousie, and that group has done a great job. So I think you should feel very confident that a visit right now is the time to do it. And I think you'll be safe. And those you're visiting will be safe as well.
Good. I'm encouraged then. Going back to, I won't keep you much longer. I just got a couple more things I wanted to bring up, but we touched on it. Children under 12, what's the timeline or the foreseeable timeline for a vaccination for children under 12?
Oh, yeah, great question. So I've seen some of the preliminary data. Effectiveness is exactly what you'd expect. Vaccines and kids are a wonderful mix together. Kids get a robust immune response. It's very, very effective, even more effective probably than what we see in the population over 16, which has been the primary immunized population really around the world. The safety data looks very good. It looks very encouraging. We aren't seeing lots of the evidence for a myocarditis signal, which is a very weak signal that was seen in young men who got second doses of the mRNA vaccines. But the regulatory authorities, particularly the states with the FDA, have asked for them to continue to collect larger numbers, because when you see rare safety signals, you need large numbers to be able to spot it, because you won't see it if you've only given it to 10,000 people, but you might see it when you get to 20,000 or 30,000, and of course even higher numbers. So I don't think we're going to see a big issue. It's going to be enormously effective. I suspect very strongly we will see an incredible response from parents into getting their kids immunized, and it'll be a really important part of our ultimate reach of 90 to 90+% of the population vaccinated, to reduce the risk of transmission. Because in addition to protecting kids from severe disease, which we know in general is lower than it is for adults, but it does happen. But really, it's going to be that reduction in transmission with getting kids vaccinated. So the timeline, the FDA is asking for accumulation of data, and I don't know that Health Canada's asked for it, but they're certainly more than happy to benefit from it. I would see the finishing collecting that data probably sometime in late September, early October. All the files are having what are called concurrent reviews. So it is like they have to collect all the data, then deliver it, then have it analyzed. That data is being analyzed real time as it feeds in from the manufacturers of the vaccine to the regulators. So I would say by mid-fall, we will see an approval for vaccination of kids, probably children between ages 2 to 12. That's likely to be there by mid-fall, sort of early November is my best guess. I always hesitate sometimes in being too much of a predictor, because somebody will say, well, I heard you on this podcast with Luke Adolfado and you said that, and that's not what happened. But it could be earlier. Could be earlier than that, but that's when I'm thinking it's probably going to happen.
I'd love to hope that this podcast has the reach that you're suggesting with that comment. So let's. All right. Well, I have one last thing. KFLNA. I think to a person, we were all bittersweet news when Dr. Kiernan Moore went to become obviously the provincial medical officer of health. I know there's an interim medical officer of health here for KFLNA. I'd often thought, listening to you and everything, that you would be the next candidate for that position. Is that something that I'm going to stir up controversy, or even a possibility?
Well, no, because I'll put it this way: there's no way on God's green earth they would make me MOH. So, medical officers of health study and are certified in a specialty called public health and epidemiology, and so that public health thing involves lots of stuff that have nothing to do with infections, right? So, smoking cessation, prenatal care, dealing with the opioid crisis, dealing with housing issues and things like that, which are important to the general health of the community in general. I'm just this narrow range guy who does infectious diseases. I'm a practicing infectious disease specialist. I see patients in consultation from doctors here at the hospital, but also from our region across here. So I don't have the right credentials. I don't think I know that much about smoking cessation that I would be a very good MOH. I do appreciate, in fact, that a few people have asked me about that, but I'm just in the wrong specialty. I would have to go back and recertify with the Royal College in public health. And I'm getting a little bit too old to go back and do that sort of thing, having been done it. But thank you very much for that for that question. But I'm not the right guy. I'm your resource guy for content knowledge and infectious diseases, but not an MOH in the making for sure.
Well, I'll leave it at that. I want to say thank you once again for taking the time. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. I know you have an extremely busy schedule, so I'm very appreciative of the time you've given us today. And I look forward to continuing to hear your snippets and your sound bites on the CBC, whether it be radio or television. And I wish you all the best and a safe rest of the summer and into the fall then. So
thank you very much, Luca, and same to you. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
All right, you too.